September 15, 1940. The skies over London are about to explode with the largest aerial battle in history. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, is convinced that today will be the day Nazi Germany crushes the Royal Air Force once and for all. He has assembled over 1,000 aircraft for a devastating knockout blow. But there's something Göring doesn't know, something his meteorologists missed. Something that a small team of British weather forecasters spotted in the atmospheric pressure readings just 24 hours earlier. A weather front. A simple shift in wind and cloud cover that would change the course of the entire war. This is the story of how one weather report and the men who read the skies saved Britain from invasion and possibly saved the free world itself.
To understand how a weather report could save an entire nation, we need to go back to the summer of 1940. Britain stands alone. France has fallen in just 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force has barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk. Across the English Channel, Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht, the most powerful military machine the world has ever seen, is preparing for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. But there's a problem. Hitler can't launch an amphibious invasion while the Royal Air Force controls British airspace. German troops crossing the Channel would be sitting ducks for RAF bombers. So Hitler gives Hermann Göring, his Luftwaffe chief, a simple order. Destroy the RAF. Achieve air superiority. Make the skies safe for invasion. And so begins the Battle of Britain. The first major military campaign fought entirely in the air. From July to October 1940, the fate of Western civilization would be decided by young pilots, many barely out of their teens, fighting and dying in the skies over southern England. But this isn't just a story about brave pilots. It's about something far less glamorous, something that rarely makes it into the history books. Meteorology, weather forecasting. The ability to read the skies and predict what's coming. Because in aerial warfare, weather isn't just a factor, it's everything.
In 1940, weather forecasting was still a relatively young science. There were no satellites, no computer models, no Doppler radar. Meteorologists relied on surface observations, barometric pressure readings, wind measurements, and reports from ships at sea. They plotted this data on large maps, drew isobars, lines of equal atmospheric pressure, and used their experience and intuition to predict what would happen next. The British had one crucial advantage: geography. Weather systems in Europe typically move from west to east, pushed by the prevailing westerly winds of the mid-latitudes. This meant that weather approaching Britain from the Atlantic would hit the British Isles before it reached continental Europe. British meteorologists could see what was coming before their German counterparts. But there was more to it than just geography. The British had invested heavily in meteorological infrastructure. They had weather stations scattered across the British Isles, in Iceland, on ships in the Atlantic, and crucially, in Ireland, which was neutral but quietly cooperative. All of this data flowed into the meteorological office in Dunston, near London, and to a secret facility that would become one of the most important installations of the war, the Central Forecasting Office at Dunstable. The RAF understood something fundamental. Air combat depended absolutely on weather conditions. Cloud cover determined visibility. Wind affected navigation and fuel consumption. Temperature influenced engine performance. Fog could ground entire air forces. Ice could kill a pilot as surely as enemy fire. And so, embedded within Fighter Command, the RAF organization responsible for defending Britain was a dedicated meteorological section. These weren't just scientists. They were military officers who understood both atmospheric physics and aerial tactics. They knew that a weather forecast wasn't just information, It was intelligence. It was a weapon.
The Luftwaffe had meteorologists too, of course, but they had a critical disadvantage. With Britain controlling the Atlantic approaches, German weather reconnaissance aircraft couldn't safely fly far enough west to gather data from the source regions of weather systems. They were essentially flying blind, trying to forecast British weather from the wrong side of the weather patterns. This might seem like a minor technical problem, but in warfare, minor problems kill people and lose battles. The Luftwaffe's weather forecasts for operations over Britain were consistently less accurate than British forecasts. German pilots would take off expecting clear skies and encounter clouds. They'd plan for good visibility and fly into fog. They'd anticipate calm conditions and face strong winds that threw off their navigation and consumed their fuel. But the Germans had another problem, one rooted in military culture rather than meteorology. Hermann Göring was not a man who liked to hear bad news. He was impulsive, overconfident, and prone to ignoring advice that contradicted his instincts. His meteorologists learned to tell him what he wanted to hear, rather than what the atmosphere was actually doing. This would prove catastrophic.
August 13, 1940. The Germans called it Adlertag, Eagle Day. It was supposed to be the beginning of the end for the RAF. Göring had planned a massive, coordinated assault involving hundreds of bombers and fighters. The goal was to destroy RAF airfields, radar stations, and aircraft on the ground. It would be the largest air operation in history up to that point. But the night before, British meteorologists detected something. A weather front was moving in from the Atlantic. Low cloud cover, poor visibility, conditions that would make mass formation flying extremely dangerous and bombing accuracy nearly impossible. The RAF commanders received this forecast and made their calculations. The weather would ground or disrupt German operations. They could afford to keep some squadrons in reserve, to rest exhausted pilots, to repair damaged aircraft. On the German side, the forecast was more optimistic, or perhaps more wishful. Göring wanted to attack, and his meteorologists told him the weather would be adequate. Not ideal, but adequate. The result was chaos. German formations took off in the early morning only to encounter the exact conditions British meteorologists had predicted. Clouds broke up formations. Poor visibility made target identification impossible. Some units received radio orders to turn back, but the messages didn't reach everyone. Some attacked, some aborted, some circled in confusion, burning precious fuel. The operation that was supposed to devastate the RAF instead became a disorganized mess. German losses were heavy, RAF losses were minimal. Eagle Day, the day that was supposed to break British resistance, was a failure. Not because of superior British fighters or better pilots, but because the Germans had bad weather intelligence and the British had good weather intelligence. This wasn't luck. This was science. This was the advantage of being able to read the Atlantic weather patterns before they reached Europe. This was the advantage of having meteorologists who told their commanders the truth rather than what they wanted to hear.
As the Battle of Britain raged through August and September, weather became an increasingly important factor in RAF strategy. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of Fighter Command, was fighting a battle of attrition he could not afford to lose. He had fewer pilots and fewer aircraft than the Germans. Every loss hurt. Every mistake was potentially fatal. Dowding used weather forecasts to make crucial decisions about when to commit his forces and when to hold back. If the forecast predicted poor conditions, he knew German bombing accuracy would be reduced, and he could afford to scramble fewer fighters, preserving his precious resources. If the forecast predicted clear skies, he knew the Germans would come in force, and he needed every available aircraft in the air. The meteorological section at Fighter Command Headquarters became one of the most important units in the entire organization.
They provided forecasts every few hours, sometimes every hour during critical periods. They briefed commanders on wind conditions at various altitudes, crucial information for pilots who needed to conserve fuel. They predicted cloud cover that could hide British fighters until the last moment, or provide cover for damaged aircraft limping home. One of the most important figures in this effort was a man whose name has been largely forgotten: Squadron Leader Magnus Spence, a meteorologist attached to Fighter Command. Spence understood that in aerial combat, timing was everything, and timing depended on weather. He developed techniques for very short-range forecasting, predicting conditions just a few hours ahead with high accuracy. This allowed RAF controllers to time their interceptions perfectly, to position fighters where they would have maximum advantage. The Germans, meanwhile, continued to struggle with weather intelligence. Their forecasts remained less accurate, their timing less precise. They would launch major raids only to find conditions had deteriorated. They would hold back aircraft expecting bad weather only to waste a day of perfect flying conditions.
Now we come to September 15, 1940, the date that would later be commemorated as Battle of Britain Day. This was the day Göring believed he would finally break the RAF. Intelligence reports, flawed intelligence as it turned out, suggested the British were down to their last few dozen fighters. One more massive blow, Göring believed, and British air defenses would collapse. The weather forecast was crucial. Göring's meteorologists predicted acceptable conditions, some cloud cover, but enough clear periods for effective bombing. Göring ordered the largest raid yet. Over 1,000 aircraft would attack London in waves throughout the day. British meteorologists saw something different in the data. They predicted that cloud conditions would be variable, periods of clear sky alternating with cloud cover. This was actually ideal for RAF tactics. The clouds would break up German formations and provide hiding places for British fighters. The clear periods would allow British pilots to see their targets and make accurate attacks. And there was something else, something subtle that only experienced meteorologists would notice. The wind conditions at altitude would favor British fighters. German bombers would face headwinds on their approach, slowing them down and consuming extra fuel. British fighters, taking off from bases inland, would have the wind at their backs as they climbed to intercept. When the German formations crossed the English coast that morning, they encountered exactly what British forecasters had predicted. The RAF was waiting in force, not depleted and exhausted as German intelligence suggested, but ready and positioned perfectly. The battle that followed was the most intense of the entire campaign. German bombers and fighters filled the sky. RAF squadrons attacked in waves. The people of London looked up and saw hundreds of aircraft wheeling and diving, vapor trails scratching white lines across the blue, aircraft falling in flames. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had lost approximately 60 aircraft. The RAF lost about 30. But more importantly, the Germans had failed to achieve their objective. They had thrown everything they had at the RAF, and the RAF was still standing, still fighting, still very much alive. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion of Britain was off. Germany would never again come so close to conquering Britain. And while many factors contributed to this outcome, the courage of the pilots, the effectiveness of radar, the quality of British fighters, weather intelligence played a crucial role. The British knew what conditions to expect and planned accordingly. The Germans did not and paid the price.
The Battle of Britain was just the beginning of weather's crucial role in World War II. As the war progressed, both sides invested heavily in meteorological capabilities, understanding that weather could determine the outcome of operations. The British established weather reconnaissance flights that flew far out into the Atlantic,
often in unarmed aircraft, gathering data at great risk. These flights were so important that they continued throughout the war, with crews knowing that capture meant certain death. They carried secrets that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The Germans attempted similar operations, but with less success. They established weather stations in remote locations, Greenland, Svalbard, even secretly in Labrador, but these were frequently discovered and destroyed by Allied forces. The Germans were fighting a losing battle for weather intelligence. One of the most famous examples of weather intelligence in World War II came in June 1944 during the planning for D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy. The story of Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist for the invasion, has become legendary. Stagg predicted a brief window of acceptable weather on June 6th, sandwiched between storms. General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, made the most important decision of the war based on that forecast. The invasion would proceed. Stagg was right. The weather was marginal but acceptable. The invasion succeeded. And crucially, the Germans, with their inferior weather intelligence, were caught by surprise. German meteorologists had predicted that the weather would be too poor for an invasion. Many German commanders were away from their posts. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impregnable coastal defense, was undermanned and unprepared. If the Germans had possessed better weather intelligence, if they had known that June 6th would be the only possible invasion date for weeks, they might have been ready. The course of the war might have been very different.
When we think of World War II heroes, we think of fighter pilots, tank commanders, infantry soldiers storming beaches. We rarely think of meteorologists hunched over weather maps in underground bunkers. But these men and women, for there were women meteorologists too, though their contributions have been even more overlooked, were absolutely crucial to Allied victory. They worked in secrecy. Their forecasts were classified at the highest levels. They couldn't tell their families what they did. They received no medals, no public recognition. When the war ended, they returned to civilian life, and their stories were forgotten. But their work saved lives. Every accurate forecast that prevented aircraft from flying into storms, every prediction that allowed operations to proceed at the optimal time, every warning that gave commanders the information they needed to make good decisions, all of this saved lives and contributed to victory. The meteorologists of Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain were fighting just as surely as the pilots in the Spitfires and Hurricanes. They were fighting with mathematics and atmospheric physics, with barometric pressure readings and wind measurements, with experience and intuition. They were fighting a battle in which the enemy couldn't see their weapons and didn't fully understand their capabilities. And they won.
The Battle of Britain proved something that military planners had suspected but never fully appreciated. In modern warfare, environmental intelligence is just as important as information about enemy forces. You can have the best equipment, the bravest soldiers, the most brilliant strategy, but if you don't understand the environment you're operating in, you will fail. This lesson transformed military meteorology. After World War II, weather forecasting became a permanent, essential component of military operations. The investment in meteorological research increased dramatically. Weather satellites, computer modeling, advanced forecasting techniques, all of these grew out of the recognition that weather intelligence could determine the outcome of conflicts. Today, military meteorologists are embedded in every level of command. No major operation proceeds without detailed weather analysis. The descendants of those World War II forecasters now use technology that would seem like magic to their predecessors, but they're doing the same fundamental job, reading the skies, predicting what's coming, giving commanders the information they need to make life and death decisions. The civilian world benefited too. Many of the advances in weather forecasting during World War II were later applied to civilian meteorology. The techniques developed to predict conditions for bomber raids and fighter interceptions became the foundation for modern weather forecasting. The next time you check a weather app on your phone, you're using technology that traces its lineage back to those desperate days in 1940 when the fate of Britain hung in the balance.
It's worth considering what might have happened if Britain had not possessed superior weather intelligence during the Battle of Britain. What if the Germans had been able to forecast British weather as accurately as the British could? What if Göring had known that Eagle Day would be a disaster and postponed it? What if German raid timing had been as precise as British interceptions? The Battle of Britain was a close-run thing. The RAF was stretched to the breaking point. Fighter command was running out of experienced pilots. A few more weeks of intensive combat might have been enough to break British air defenses. If the Germans had been able to optimize their operations using accurate weather forecasts, if they had been able to avoid costly mistakes caused by unexpected weather, they might have achieved air superiority. And if they had achieved air superiority, Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, might have proceeded. Britain might have fallen just as France had fallen, just as Poland and Norway and Denmark and the Netherlands and Belgium had fallen. Without Britain as a base, there would have been no staging ground for the liberation of Europe, no D-Day, no bomber offensive against German industry. The United States might have focused entirely on the Pacific War against Japan, leaving Europe to its fate. The Soviet Union would have faced Germany alone, without the crucial supplies that came through British ports, without the Second Front that eventually divided German forces. The entire course of the war, and therefore the entire shape of the modern world, might have been different. Democracy might have survived only in the Americas. Fascism might have dominated Europe for generations. This is not hyperbole. This is not exaggeration. The stakes in 1940 were exactly this high. And one of the factors, not the only factor, but a crucial factor, that determined the outcome was the ability of British meteorologists to read the weather better than their German counterparts. A weather report, a forecast, a prediction about clouds and wind and fog. It sounds almost absurd, but it's true. Behind all the talk of isobars and pressure systems and forecasting techniques, we must remember that this is ultimately a human story. Real people made these forecasts. Real people staked their reputations and the lives of thousands of others on their interpretations of atmospheric data. Imagine the pressure. You're a meteorologist at Fighter Command Headquarters. It's September 1940. Britain is losing the war. The Luftwaffe is bombing British cities every day. Hundreds of people are dying. And you're being asked to predict the weather 12 hours from now, 24 hours from now, because lives depend on your forecast. If you predict good weather and you're wrong, RAF fighters will scramble unnecessarily, wasting fuel and exhausting pilots. If you predict bad weather and you're wrong, German bombers will get through uncontested and people will die. There is no margin for error. There is no room for doubt. You must make your forecast, and you must be right. The stress must have been unbearable. And yet, these men and women did their jobs, day after day, month after month, with remarkable accuracy. They didn't get it right every time, no meteorologist ever does, but they got it right enough. They gave Fighter Command the information it needed to survive. Some of them broke under the pressure. There are records of meteorologists suffering nervous breakdowns, of others requesting transfers to combat units where, ironically, they felt the stress would be less intense. But most of them persevered. They understood that their work mattered,
They understood that they were fighting the war just as surely as anyone in uniform.
For those interested in the actual meteorology involved, it's worth understanding some of the technical aspects of weather forecasting during the Battle of Britain. The primary tool was synoptic meteorology, the analysis of weather patterns over large areas at specific times. Meteorologists would receive observations from weather stations across Britain and from ships at sea. These observations included temperature, barometric pressure, humidity, wind speed and direction, cloud cover, and visibility. This data would be plotted on large maps using standardized symbols. Isobars, lines connecting points of equal barometric pressure, would be drawn. These isobars revealed the location and intensity of high-pressure and low-pressure systems, which in turn determined wind patterns and weather conditions. Meteorologists used several rules of thumb to make forecasts. Low-pressure systems generally brought clouds, precipitation, and poor visibility, bad flying weather. High-pressure systems brought clear skies and good visibility, ideal for air operations. The movement of these systems was tracked from one synoptic map to the next, allowing forecasters to predict where they would be hours or days in the future. Fronts, boundaries between air masses of different temperatures, were particularly important. Cold fronts, where cold air pushes under warm air, often brought rapid weather changes, clouds, storms, strong winds. Warm fronts, where warm air rides over cold air, brought more gradual changes, increasing clouds, steady precipitation, and reduced visibility. The forecasters also paid close attention to upper air conditions. Weather balloons carrying instruments called radiosondes were launched twice daily from stations across Britain. These measured temperature, pressure, and humidity at various altitudes, providing a three-dimensional picture of the atmosphere. This was crucial for predicting conditions at the altitudes where combat occurred, typically between 15,000 and 30,000 feet. Wind forecasts were particularly important. Pilots needed to know wind speed and direction at their operating altitude to calculate navigation and fuel consumption. A strong headwind could mean the difference between making it home and running out of fuel over the English Channel. Cloud forecasts determined tactics. High cloud cover could hide German bombers from British fighters. Low cloud cover could hide British fighters from German bombers. No clouds meant visual combat with no place to hide. The type of cloud mattered too. Cumulus clouds indicated instability and possible turbulence. Stratus clouds indicated stable conditions but poor visibility. All of this analysis was done by hand, with pencil and paper, using slide rules for calculations. There were no computers. There was no automated data processing. It was pure human skill, experience, and intuition backed by scientific principles. And it worked. Not perfectly. Nothing in meteorology is perfect, but well enough to give Britain a crucial advantage.
Beyond the day-to-day forecasting that guided tactical decisions, there were several specific weather events during the Battle of Britain that had major strategic impacts. In late August 1940, a series of Atlantic storms moved across Britain, bringing days of poor flying weather. The Luftwaffe was forced to reduce operations significantly. This gave the RAF a desperately needed respite. Damaged aircraft were repaired. Exhausted pilots got rest. New pilots completed training and joined squadrons. Airfields that had been bombed were patched up. When the weather cleared and the Luftwaffe resumed full-scale operations in early September, the RAF was stronger than it had been a week earlier. Those storms, which British meteorologists had predicted accurately, allowing commanders to plan for the operational pause, may have been the difference between survival and collapse. In October, as the Battle of Britain was winding down, autumn weather patterns asserted themselves. Fog became more common. Days shortened, reducing the hours available for daylight operations. Storms became more frequent and more intense. the Luftwaffe found it increasingly difficult to maintain pressure on the RAF. Hitler, frustrated by the Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority, shifted strategy. Instead of attacking RAF airfields and aircraft, the Luftwaffe would focus on bombing British cities, the Blitz. This was a strategic blunder. The Blitz was terrible for British civilians, but it allowed the RAF to recover fully. By spring 1941, fighter command was stronger than ever, and the threat of invasion had passed. Weather didn't cause Hitler to make this strategic mistake, but it contributed to the circumstances that led to it. The Luftwaffe's inability to achieve decisive results was partly due to weather-related operational difficulties. Difficulties that British forces with better weather intelligence were better able to manage.
So, did one weather report save Britain? In a literal sense, no. The Battle of Britain was won by many factors: the courage of RAF pilots, the effectiveness of radar, the quality of British fighters, the strategic mistakes of the German High Command, and yes, superior British weather intelligence. But weather intelligence was more than just a contributing factor. It was a force multiplier that made everything else more effective. Accurate forecasts allowed the RAF to use its limited resources optimally. Poor German forecasts degraded Luftwaffe effectiveness and led to costly mistakes. If we want to identify a single weather report that had the greatest impact, September 15, 1940 is the strongest candidate. The forecast that morning gave RAF commanders the information they needed to position their forces perfectly for the decisive battle of the campaign. The forecast was accurate. The tactics based on it were successful. The Germans were defeated. The invasion was canceled. But perhaps it's more accurate to say that it wasn't one weather report, but hundreds of weather reports, day after day, week after week, month after month, each one giving British commanders a small advantage, each one making RAF operations slightly more efficient, each one imposing a small cost on German operations. These small advantages accumulated. They compounded. And ultimately, they contributed to Britain's survival. The meteorologists who made these forecasts were ordinary people doing extraordinary work under incredible pressure. They were scientists who became warriors, fighting with knowledge instead of weapons. They couldn't shoot down enemy aircraft, but they could give RAF pilots the information they needed to shoot down enemy aircraft. They couldn't bomb German airfields, but they could predict when German bombers would come and where RAF fighters should wait for them. They saved Britain. They helped save the world. And for decades, almost nobody knew. Now you know. Now you understand that when you hear about the Battle of Britain, about the few who fought in the skies over southern England in 1940, you should also remember the meteorologists. Remember the men and women who read the skies, who predicted the storms, who gave commanders the gift of foresight in a time when every decision could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Remember that in warfare, information is power. Environmental intelligence is just as important as intelligence about enemy forces. And sometimes the difference between victory and defeat, between freedom and tyranny, between one future and another, comes down to something as simple as knowing whether it will rain tomorrow. The weather report that saved Britain wasn't just a forecast. It was a weapon. It was wielded by unsung heroes, and it changed the course of history.